بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. نويت تعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير ونفذ إفادة استفادة، وحتى تمس بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم، ودعاء إلى هدى ودلالة على خير، اتباع وسلام وطاعته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وينفعنا بما تعلمنا، وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما، إنك على كل شيء قدير. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings be upon you all. And inshallah, we hope that you're all doing well. Um, Jazakallah khairan. Thank you for joining us for our Living Islam session that we have on a monthly basis. And inshallah, uh, for those who may have not joined us previously for Living Islam, one thing to note is that this is not a lecture, this is not a dars. This is purely a open discussion, an open forum, an open conversation. I think is probably the better way of putting it. So I have nothing prepared whatsoever. And how our night goes is solely based upon our active engagement with one another. So essentially, the more that we actively engage with one another, the more that we will get out of today's session. The less that we actively engage with one another, the slower the time may go by. Mashallah. But yeah, so again, I have nothing actually prepared. And so this is solely for um participation um in relation to this particular program. And so I will kind of cease talking, and I will open up the floor to everyone else. Not everyone at once. Uh, Someone placed in the chat, what are the first steps to take to begin to convert slash learn? Another one as well, who wasn't here yet, but was someone that was going to ask about shaving. Okay, so we'll go with the first one that came to me. In terms of converting slash learning. So someone else actually just today asked me about the aspect of converting. So the aspect of converting to Islam, or sometimes people like to use the term reverting, is that it's actually a very simple process. And the process really is something that takes place in the heart. So that essentially once a person comes to the belief in their heart that Allah is the only one and true God. And of course, when we say Allah, that is, in amongst other things, the way that you say the one supreme God in Arabic. So just so that people don't have a misconception, because sometimes people think that when Muslims use the term Allah, they're talking about some type of specific contingent God that lives in the Kaaba at Mecca or something of this nature. But when we say Allah in terms of Muslims, we're talking about the one creator who is the necessary being who created all that is in existence. And so once a person believes that there's only one God, one creator, one necessary being, and then they believe that the Prophet Muhammad SAW is his final messenger, and they affirm and believe in everything that he's been sent with, then essentially that person is a Muslim. And so, because the reality of it is that you can have a person that, for example, takes the Shahada, they say the kalima la ilaha illallah Muhammad, and they could be of the biggest of hypocrites. And so, in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah knows about that person, that that person is not truly Muslim. However, in the case of a person who truly believes in their hearts the Shahada, but they may have never verbally uttered it in front of someone, that person would be considered to be a Muslim. And so, from that perspective, the Shahada that happens between the person and their Lord, which is, of course, the most important Shahada, that is something that takes place in the heart. In regards to converting in terms of a formal conversion in front of people, that is something that, again, is not necessary. However, many people may choose to do it. And really, all it is saying what I just mentioned, the Shahada, meaning that a person bear witness that there is no God except for Allah and that the Prophet Muhammad is his last and final messenger. And really, that is only a necessity from the standpoint of worldly affairs, meaning that, for example, because there are certain rights that a Muslim is only allowed to give to other Muslims, then in order to affirm that a person who was previously known to be non-Muslim is a Muslim, then some entities and organizations may require that there be some type of documentation that states or shows that this person has converted to Islam. Or, for example, if a person is trying to get married to someone who is Muslim, then there may, be asked that if there's witnesses or documentation that shows that this person has, again, formally converted to Islam. So the process of becoming Muslim is very simple. It's just essentially, from the essence of it, it's just a matter of, do you believe in the tenets of Islam? Now, the aspect of learning, that is a lifelong journey. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "Talab al-ilm farida ala kulli Muslim," that the seeking of knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. Um, just give me 1 second. Sorry about that. But the aspect of learning is that this is an ongoing process. The Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that talab al-ilm farida ala kulli Muslim, that the seeking of knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. And so for every Muslim, they have what is referred to as the fard ayn, the personally obligatory knowledge. And so this knowledge is the knowledge of, for example, how to pray, how to fast, how to pay zakat if one has enough wealth, how to make Hajj if a person has the requirement to do so. If a person wants to get married, what are the rulings related to having a spouse, and so on and so forth. So these things are personally obligatory for every Muslim to know. And so a person would take the means that they have available to them to learn these things. So for example, at the Mecca Center, we provide information in regards to some of these basic aspects. And so a person could utilize what they have and ability of the Mecca Center. You have other organizations that are online, for example, like Seekers Guidance or Safina Society and ArcView or other online venues. You also have in-person venues. You have places that are uh, full seminaries or even a college slash universities like Zaytuna College. So the aspect of seeking knowledge is something that is at a base level going to be a requirement for everyone in regards to what is personally obligatory upon that individual. And so again, some of the basic things are going to be the prayer, the fast, the zakat, the alms tax, and so on and so forth. Um, Once a person acquires that knowledge, meaning that they have the necessary knowledge that they need to go about their basic lives in an Islamic way, then you get into what's referred to as Fard Kifaya. Fard Kifaya, this is communal obligatory knowledge, meaning that this is knowledge that not every individual Muslim needs to know, but sorry, but as long as someone within the Muslim community knows, so as long as someone within the Muslim community knows this knowledge, then that suffices for everyone else knowing. And so, for example, if a person wished to, they can pursue communal obligatory knowledge. So, for example, if a person wanted to become an Islamic scholar and they wanted to focus on the science of hadith, of statements of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, then a person could go ahead and pursue that, and they will be fulfilling a Fard Kifaya, communal obligation for all other Muslims in their area, such that they would not be required to go out and study the different aspects of the science of hadith, for example. And so this is basically how knowledge is broken down from an Islamic perspective. You have the personal obligatory knowledge as well as the communal knowledge. The personal obligatory knowledge is that which is required upon every individual Muslim. And then you have the communal knowledge that as long as someone within the Muslim community pursues this knowledge, then it suffices for everyone else. And so with personal obligatory knowledge, there are different um, places and sources that a person can utilize in order to obtain this particular knowledge, including the Mecca Center. Um, and then there was a question that someone was asking. I believe they may have put it in ahead of time in regards to shaving. And so I'm assuming that that the question is referring to men shaving, or it could be for women as well. But essentially, for men, and particularly if you're talking about the beard, is that ideally, from the standpoint of Islam, a man would let his beard grow, meaning that he would leave the hair that grows particularly along the chin bone and the jawbone, that he would leave that hair, but at the same time that he would maintain it, meaning that he would comb it, he would oil it, he would make sure that it was looking neat and proper. However, he would not take a razor to it and shave it off. However, the scholars, they've differed in terms of the aspect of, for example, trimming or shaping up the beard. Some scholars have permitted it. Some scholars have said that, essentially no, that, there should be no cutting of the hair. And then some scholars have mentioned that, for example, in regards to the hair that grows on the chin, that if a man has extremely long hair, such that if they were to cup the hair on the chin and you still had hair that grew at the bottoms of the palms, meaning that, for example, if there was hair that were sticking out from my fist after grabbing at the bottom of my chin, then a man could cut that portion of hair off, that they could essentially shave that portion of hair off. Um, but the safest position is that a man would keep his beard, but if he's going to keep the beard, that he would keep it looking neat and tidy, again, oiling it and combing it. And that also, and this is something that I need to do, is that he would trim the mustache. And there's difference of opinion. Some scholars say that he would he could, just trim all the way down the mustache. Others would say that he would actually keep the mustache, but he would trim the bottom hairs such that the pinkness of the lip would be able to be seen. So basically that the ends of the hairs, that he would trim those so that the hair was not growing over his lips. Now, when it comes to shaving of other bodily hair, this would be something that would be both for men and women, is that the hair that grows under the armpit and the hair that grows on the pelvic bone and pelvic area and really just the private area in general, that hair should be shaved. And that ideally a person would shave it every week. If they're able to do it on Yom Juma, that's considered to be what is best. But to not let it go 40 days or more without shaving it. That if you were to allow for the hair under the armpits or the hair in the pubic area to go unshaven for 40 days, that would actually be disliked. That would be makruh, as we would say in Arabic. And so a person would be um, uh, in a situation that is disliked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so as a Muslim, we should have a regular habit of trying to keep ourselves properly groomed. And the shaving of the hair underneath the armpits and below the navel, that is considered to be from the aspect of proper grooming. And Allah knows best. Someone placed in the chat, I'm just getting started in my journey to decide if I will convert. Do you have any advice? My advice would be to strive to learn from people who have connections um, from teacher to teacher to teacher, going back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu and then trying to be in good company of the Muslims. And I know this is kind of like vague advice, but the thing is that um, actually, I can do you one better. My advice to you would be to look up a course that is called Why Islam is True. And you can look at that course and basically everything that I would want to kind of tell you, you inshallah will be able to find in that course. Because it's the course is ran by a teacher who has that connection that I'm mentioning. And he's a person that does have good character uh, as well. And so um, there's free aspects to it as well as aspects that you could pay for. But even if you to just take the free aspects to it, that would inshallah also be sufficient as well. So yeah, so I would suggest if you look up Why Islam is True, um, and this through was referred to, the organization is called Basira Education, Basira. And the Why Islam is True course, I think that could be um, a definitely good starting point for anyone, but in particular, someone who's just looking into Islam. Can those other online venues by message, please? So yeah, so Jazakallah khair. So you have I referenced seekersguidance.org, zaytuna.edu. There's also Safina Society. I think it's safinasociety.org, but don't quote me on it. Uh, but even if you just like Google Safina Society, um, you should be able to find it fairly easily. Um, Someone has a question in regards to wudu. I have a question about wudu, especially when it comes to wiping over the sock. I work in the emergency room, and when performing my wudu, I always wash my feet. But a Muslim sister at work told me I can wipe over my sock, but I remember from previous class it has to be a leather sock. But please go over this again. Also, is it permissible to dye my few gray hairs black? So, in regards to the sock, the majority of scholars do say that to wipe over a sock, it needs to be either leather or leather-like. So what I will usually recommend for people is that if they look up, for example, wudu socks, they are a sock that are not as thick as leather, but they still meet the requirements of being leather-like enough, such that they would be deemed to be permissible to wipe over. So, like I said, you could literally just look up wudu socks, um, and that would that would make it a little bit easier. Um, inshallah ta'ala. And again, they're fairly thin, such that they're not much thicker than regular cotton socks that people will wear. And in this case, you would be able to still wipe over the sock and not have to worry about some of the difference of opinion in regards to it. That, essentially 3 out of the 4 schools of law would deem it to be permissible for a person to wipe over these type of socks, wudu socks. Um, However, there is one school, the Hanbali school of law, that is a little bit more lenient in terms of what they deem to be permissible socks to wipe over. But you would need to kind of get the details of that. Um, so I say that to say that um, we don't want to say that, for people who have, wiped over regular cotton socks, that their wudu was necessarily invalid. Because again, in the Hanbali school, that could be considered to be permissible. But again, in regards to going forward and acting upon it, I would suggest if a person wanted to take that position, that they go about learning the rulings within the Hanbali school itself to make sure that they were following those rulings correctly. And coincidentally, Safina Society, if I'm not mistaken, is actually going to be doing a class specifically in Hanbali fiqh. So if a person wanted to learn Hanbali fiqh, then they would have a recourse to go to for that. And Allah knows best. And then another question was in regards to dyeing the hair black. Generally speaking, the Prophet Muhammad SAW, he has actually forbidden the Muslims from dyeing their hair black, and particularly if a person their hair is naturally black and now they have grays. However, the sunnah is that a person can dye their gray hairs with henna. So that is considered to be sunnah, that's considered to be praiseworthy. And so if a person wanted to dye their hair that is turning gray, then it's recommended to use henna. Sometimes I myself will use henna in some of the grays that are coming in my beard. It's just a reminder that I'm just getting old.
Oh, bad.
What is the process of divorce in Islam? So the process of divorce in Islam is actually very simple. The Prophet Muhammad SAW, he actually mentioned that 3 things are taken seriously, even if they're said in jest. Even if they're said jokingly, they're taken seriously. And those 3 things were marriage, divorce, and raja meaning um returning one's wife after having divorced her either once or twice. Um, but in another narration, I believe it also says the 3 things are marriage, divorce, and freeing of a slave. But in any case, the actual process of divorce in Islam is that the man is naturally given the rights of divorce at the completion of a marital contract. A woman can acquire the right to divorce, but it's not given to her automatically through the contract itself. It's a situation where she can make it a condition of her contract. Like she can say, for example, I will marry myself to this individual on condition that she has the right to divorce if he were to take on a second wife, for example. And the thing is that nothing I say here should be something that people just kind of go off and run with without first double checking with a scholar in regards to it. Because there are certain details in terms of how something can be said and how the conditions have to be made. I'm just giving a general condition that is possible, because there's more detail that I can go into to kind of clarify what I just said. Again, I'm just using it as like a basic example. But in any case, a woman, she can give herself the right to divorce, but again, it doesn't come just at the completion of the marital contract. She has to make it something that is placed in the contract specifically. And also, if she didn't initially do that, meaning that she didn't give herself the right to divorce initially in the contract, there is the possibility of, for example, seeking out the marriage to be annulled because of some type of harm or some type of deficiency that is happening within the marriage, or seeking out what's called the khula, where she gives some type of monetary incentive for her husband to divorce her. Now, the process of divorce for the man is very simple in the sense that if a man says something directly that means divorce to his wife, then that will constitute a divorce. And if he says something that is ambiguous, meaning that it could mean divorce or it could not mean divorce, then we go based upon what was his intention in saying it. But the thing is that all it is a verbal utterance, and all it takes is one time. And so if a man says something either direct, meaning, for example, he uses the word divorce towards his wife, or he says something indirect, like he says something to the like of, that him and his wife are through or something like that, then we go based upon what his intention was. Did he mean by what he said divorce or not? And again, if he says it once, that actually constitutes a divorce. If he says it twice, that also constitutes a divorce. If he says it 3 times, that also counts as a divorce. But in the first time, he can take his wife back. And the second time, he can also take his wife back. And the third time, if he says it, he cannot take his wife back. And the only way that he will be able to take his wife back is if she finishes her idda period, which is her period of maintenance, where she is not allowed to marry anyone else. And she has to wait approximately 3 menstrual cycles or 3 cycles of purity. And then once she finishes that idda period, then she would have to marry someone else, consummate that marriage, then be separated from that man, and then finish the idda period for that man, and then she could possibly go back to that original husband that had divorced her 3 times. I say that to say that unfortunately, too many Muslims have this idea that that divorce in Islam does not count unless a man says it 3 times, and that is not true. That even if a man says it once, it counts. And so, if a man says it 3 times or more, then that means that he's just made that woman irrevocable for him. Again, unless she marries someone else, consummates that marriage, and then for whatever reason decides to go back to this man. Now, that is the aspect of divorce. The aspect of marriage is, again, the Prophet ﷺ, he wanted for marriage to be very simple for his ummah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted for marriage to be made simple, because when you make the halal difficult, then the haram becomes easy. And so marriage in Islam, the only thing that is required is, in a basic sense, is that you have a wali, who is going to be the representative of the bride, the guardian of the bride. And then you have the groom or representative for the groom. And then there is 2 witnesses, 2 male witnesses, and there is an offer and acceptance of the marriage. And it has to be something that specifies marriage specifically, meaning that it cannot be anything that is ambiguous. It has to be using terminologies that can only mean marriage. So, for example, in English, we would say something like, I marry you, my daughter. Or in Arabic is even more specific, where you would say, for example, zawajtuka binti. And there's like a particular formula of why it has to be said like that. Like it has to be said in the past tense. And you have to special, and the man has more than one daughter, then he has to specify which daughter it is, and so on and so forth. But it's the aspect of making sure that there is no ambiguity in regards to the marriage that is taking place. But it's a very simplistic process in that all it is a verbal offer and a verbal acceptance of the marriage with two witnesses being present to bear witness that this marriage has taken place. That's like the very simple aspect of it, and then it can definitely get more sophisticated, and usually it is going to be more sophisticated. Um, no problem, no problem. You're welcome. What I'm actually going to do right now is where I am on the northeast, it's more or less Maghrib time. And also my computer is about to die. Well, not necessarily about to die, but the battery's getting a little low. I'm going to uh, have us take a break right now so that for those of us who are on the northeast who need to pray Maghrib, that we will be able to pray Maghrib. And also, this being the month of Rabi Awwal, I will encourage all of us that when we finish our Salat al-Maghrib, that we ensure that we are sending salawats upon the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And so this is the least that we can do, as this is a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this being the month of Rabi Awwal, which is commonly acknowledged as being the month that the Prophet was born in, that this can be acting as a reminder for us to increase in our salawats upon the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so it can be something as simple as Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, or if you want to go even further, for example, the Prophet informed us that the best way of sending salawats upon him is the Salat Ibrahima, where you say Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. And so again, I will encourage all of us to increase in our salawats. But inshallah ta'ala, we will take a break so that we can, again, for those of us who are in the Northeast, that we can have the time that we need to pray Salat al-Maghrib. And then we will come back right after that, inshallah. بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه من والاه. So, alhamdulillah, inshallah, for those who had to break for salat, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept your salat. And inshallah, hopefully you were able to also uh, engage in some dhikr and salawat upon the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I think we left off, sister from those who are watching from YouTube. What do you do, or how would you handle a situation when someone has committed a sin against you, then asks for forgiveness, but continues to show no mercy or compassion to you? Um, it really just depends on the person. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He loves those who are merciful and that will pardon others. And so if you wish to be of that caliber, then that is the higher route. That is the route that is more pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the route that will actually increase the likelihood that you will gain the mercy and the pardoning of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the one that is composed of these most perfect attributes. So He is the Arhamar Rahimeen, He is Al-Afu, so He is the most merciful, the merciful, He is the pardoner. And so whatever mercy or whatever pardoning that we show, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His mercy and His pardoning is even greater than that. However, it doesn't mean that a person necessarily has to. So a person does not have to accept, does not necessarily have to forgive someone that has wronged them, or a person can still look to seek um, a dunyawi form of justice for the injustice that has been caused to them. But even if a person were to forgive or were to pardon a person who has wronged them, it does not mean that you have to place yourself in a situation to continuously be harmed. So that if a person decides to forgive someone, they can forgive them, but it doesn't mean that you forget or that you allow yourself to be placed in harm's way again. So, for example, I can forgive someone who, for example, may have misappropriated my money. So for example, I give someone money um, as a loan, and then they just never pay me back. I may forgive them for not paying me back, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to necessarily loan the money again. And so I can forgive or pardon someone, but I don't have to put myself in a position where I'm going to be susceptible to their harm a second or third time around. And so I should, take the means to remove myself from their harm. But in terms of forgiving or overlooking, that is going to be a person's personal choice. But again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves those who are willing to do so. There was a question. Um, what is the perspective on homosexuality? I have a gay sibling, and I'm not sure how that would be interpreted. So the position that is in the held position within Islam, and more or less Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about this in the Quran, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has not allowed for there to be any type of intimate relationship between members of the same sex. So that also extends to the aspect of marriage, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's legislated that marriage can be between a man and a woman, but marriage cannot be between two men or two women. However, having said that, Islam does not um, take a person to account if they have feelings of an intimate nature towards someone of the same gender, but rather that person is in a position where they can do one of two things. That if that person has intimate feelings towards a person of the same gender. However, they they control those feelings such that they don't act upon those feelings, even though those feelings may be strong, then that person will be rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That person will receive tremendous rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because despite their strong urges and their strong feelings, they are choosing to obey the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The other option that a person can have is that a person can decide that they are going to act upon those feelings. And in that case, that person would have committed a sin, meaning that they would have engaged in a prohibition that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has legislated as being a prohibition. And so in that case, that person would be eligible for the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he can determine whether or not he will forgive a person or whether he will possibly punish a person. But the position is that that is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not allowed for a person to act upon. So having a feeling of intimate feelings towards someone of the same gender, that is not a sin. It's what a person does in relation to that, meaning do they act upon those feelings or do they control those feelings for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in the case of someone who controls those feelings, then they will be rewarded for the difficulties that they will be going through in terms of not acting upon the feelings that they may have. Whereas if a person decides that they will still act upon them, then that would be a situation where they are placing themselves in a position where they will be eligible for the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah will decide whether or not he may punish a person for acting upon those feelings, or whether he may decide to forgive and overlook that person. So that is, in general, the position of Islam. Can you give your suggestions on book on creed or aqidah? Really, for something like that, my suggestion would be to study with a teacher. So for example, Ustadh Murad, who is one of the teachers here at the Mecca Center, he usually pretty much always has a class on Aqidah, almost every semester. I don't know if this upcoming semester he necessarily is doing it, but Aqidah is one of his main subjects that he usually teaches. And so I would suggest studying with the teacher so that things can be clarified. Like I could definitely, give different book recommendations. It's just that it's not a guarantee that a person will necessarily have the correct understanding in terms of something that they read. And so it's much better to go over it with a teacher, especially if it's a person's first time. However, if I were to give like a generic recommendation, then I could recommend, for example, the book of Imam Sahawi. Usually it's said, the title that's usually associated with is Aqidah Tahawiyah. But it's the book of a Hanafi Imam Tahawi. And it's considered to be one of the first foundational books of Aqidah. And so I can recommend that work. And there have been a number of translations that have been done. Probably one translation that I could recommend is Hamza Yusuf's translation of Aqidah Tahawiyah. Hamza Yusuf's translation, actually, it includes the Arabic as well as the English in that particular translation. So again, my first suggestion would be to, study it with a teacher, but in the case, uh, and the thing is that that is not necessarily a difficult thing to do. Like I said, Ustadh Murad usually will have classes on Aqidah. Also, if a person wanted to, Seeker's Guidance has, multiple different classes on Aqidah. So it is feasible for someone to do it with a teacher. But if you're looking just for uh, a general book on Aqidah, and then the Aqidah Tahawiyah can be a recommendation that I can give. Is it a sin to continue to be friendly with my sibling if they're acting upon their feelings, or would I keep my sibling away from the Muslim community in general? Can I tell my Muslim friends about my sibling? So the thing is that the reality of, for example, someone who may decide to act upon a sin, and particularly if they're not Muslim, is that the reality of it is that that is, essentially anyone who is not Muslim is necessarily going to be doing something that is going to be deemed sinful within Islam. And so the thing is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's encouraged us and He's commanded us to keep up ties with our families. So no, I would not tell you to cut off your relationships with your sibling. And if anything, trying to be empathetic with your sibling and trying to be a good example as a Muslim with your sibling and making dua for your sibling so that hopefully that need for your sibling to incline towards Islam and such that your sibling may even eventually decide to become Muslim themselves. So because the thing is that for one, even from amongst the Muslims, what Muslim can say that they don't engage in some type of sinful activity? And the reality of it is that, all of us, have sins that we struggle with. This is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam have already informed us of. As the Prophet said, "Kuli bani Adam khata." Every son of Adam will make mistakes, meaning that they will commit sins. And so one of the aspects that we, look at in terms of non-Muslims is that we consider them to be ahl da'wah, is that we consider them to be the people of da'wah, meaning that the people who the da'wah, the invitation to Islam is to be given to. And then also because this is a sibling, this is someone that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded for you to not break family ties with, then no, I would not tell you to break your ties with your sibling. However, just as in any other situation, if a person is committing a sin, then we aren't going to try to be around when they're in the midst of committing a sin. But outside of that, you can definitely continue to have, and I would encourage you to have a good relationship with your sibling with the intention of trying to be a good example for them, such that inshallah they may themselves decide to uh, come to Islam at a later day. And so continuously making dua for them and having a good relationship with them. And in terms of telling other people, like the thing is that uh as a Muslim, we don't try to expose the sins that we may know of other people. And so, you know, telling other Muslims about your sibling, that's one thing in terms of just like telling them, oh, I have a brother or I have a sister. But, telling like for example, if it wasn't for the situation where your sibling was gay, you wouldn't necessarily tell other people, whether Muslim or not, that, oh, I have a sibling, oh, and they happen to be heterosexual. Like, that wouldn't even be a normative conversation, generally speaking. And so in the same way, um, you wouldn't have to mention what your sibling sexuality is, because the reality of it, and this is something that unfortunately many Muslims, we don't even know because of the way that we socially understand homosexuality and so on and so forth, is that from an Islamic standpoint, even if we see someone that we have an inclination that they may be homosexual or that they have different behaviors that we would assume that they're homosexual, it is actually not permissible for us to assume that that person is a homosexual. That we're not we're not to look into it, we're not to ask about it, and we are to do our best not to make the assumptions of it. And so there's no reason to mention, someone's sexuality that is not in the realm of us as Muslims in terms of our interaction with people. And it goes against what the Prophet ﷺ has mentioned to us in regards to the perfection of our own Islam. The Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned, "Min husn Islam mar'i tarkuhu ma la ya'ni." The Prophet ﷺ, he said, from the excellence of a person's Islam is that they leave those things that do not concern them. And so, there's no reason to mention, what your siblings' sexuality may be. وإياكم. Are there different levels of badness and sins? Eating pork versus yes, there is a hierarchy in terms of sin, quote unquote. So, for example, the ulama, they will distinguish sins between what is referred to as kiba'ir wa sighair, between major and minor sins. Generally speaking, major sins are going to be sins that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Messenger of Allah sallallahu have specifically mentioned different punishments for, whether if they be punishments in this life or punishments in the next life. And then you'll have minor sins, which are lesser, but we have been informed that they are not permissible. So yes, there are considered to be different levels of sins. Um, and so like you have what are kind of considered to be the mubiqat, which are the seven deadly sins, which essentially are committing shirk, which is associating partners with God, committing murder, involving oneself intentionally and without excuse and interest, um, to accuse falsely a woman of adultery, to unjustly use up the wealth of an orphan, or to unjustly use the wealth of an orphan, to flee the disbelievers in battle, that is not a strategic retreat, or to commit black magic. These are considered to be the mubiqat, the seven deadly sins that hold a person down in hellfire. And then you have major sins like, for example, uquq walidain, which is being undutiful to one's parents, murder, um, uh, fornication, um, homosexuality would be included, um, and so on and so forth. So the thing is that there are levels, but the thing is that the ulama, the scholars, particularly the scholars of tazkiyah, of purification of the heart, what they mention is that really a Muslim should not think about sins in regards to major and minor, but rather they should think about sins from the standpoint of who is the one that one is sinning against. And so whenever we commit a sin, whether it will be classified as major or minor, basically what's happening is that we, especially if we do it knowingly, is that we are saying that this thing that we're going to be doing has now become more important to us than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is a very dangerous position to be in. And so, whether it's minor or major, any sin, a Muslim should be extremely fearful of, and try their best to avoid it as much as possible. And if we do fall into it, or when we do fall into it, being very quick to repent from it. Um, that is the most ideal situation that, yes, we will fall into sin, but we should never be content with it, and we should repent immediately as soon as possible when they do happen. And dating, other than that, then no, it's not permissible for a Muslim to date, especially dating from the Western concept of dating. And actually, unintentionally forgetting to pray, meaning like a person truly forgot that they didn't pray, for example, Asr or Maghrib or something like that, that is actually not a sin. They would still need to pray that prayer as soon as they remembered. But if they legitimately forgot, they truly forgot that they did not pray, then that is actually not sinful. If you have the ability to do Umrah, should you do Umrah or should you just save up to go to Hajj instead? Uh, I mean, the ulama, they differ in regards to whether or not they consider Umrah to be an obligation or a sunnah. So, for example, um, in the Shafi'i madhab, Umrah is considered to be an obligation. And so if a person has the means to go for Umrah, then you can arguably say that they should probably think about taking that, because there's no guarantee that they will be able to get to go to Hajj. However, at the same time, um, it the argument could be made that if a person feels that they will be able to ultimately save up for Hajj, then they could consider to do that, because when you go for Hajj, generally speaking, what people will do is that they will do Umrah and Hajj. And so you could consider it to be better to strive to save up to actually just go for the major pilgrimage, the Hajj, with the intention that you're going to do both Umrah and Hajj when you go to Hajj, which is usually what people do anyway. And so again, if a person feels that they would be able, just might take a little bit longer, but they feel that they truly would be able to save up ultimately to be able to go for Hajj, then inshallah they can make that intention that they plan to do their Umrah and Hajj um when they actually go for Hajj. And Allah knows best. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. It's no problem. What is the perspective on pets slash dogs? So in general, if a person decides to take on a pet, then they've taken on the role of um fulfilling the rights of that particular animal. So it's not considered to be necessarily a sunnah or anything of that nature to take on a pet. But if a person does take on a pet, then now they have taken on the responsibility of making sure that that particular animal is taken care of. So it's a major responsibility in regards to making sure that you're able to give that particular animal their rights. And it could possibly be a situation where a person could be held accountable if they don't give a animal their rights. However, in regards to dogs as well as certain other animals as well, dogs would are not something that a Muslim would be permitted to take on as a pet. A dog can only be owned by a Muslim if they're going to be used for essentially one of three slash four things. Is that they would either be used for security or as a sheepdog in terms of farming or for hunting, and in our modern times for some type of medical situation. So, for example, a seeing eye dog or the like. And generally speaking, in those situations, the most ideal situation is that the dog would not actually be living inside of the house, that there would be some type of home that was made and that was actually suitable for a dog to live outside of the home, and again, they would be used for one of those four things. Uh, so that's in relation to dogs. And there are other animals that are deemed to either be possibly makruh. Some scholars would even say haram, to have as pets. So things like any animal that could possibly cause you harm. So for example, certain types of snakes in particular, for example, that is known to cause harm. Some scholars would just say in general, it would be makruh to own a snake, for example, or geckos, which are something that the Prophet ﷺ had said that you actually receive reward for killing. So it would be offensive for a person to have geckos or scorpions as well. Uh, and so there are certain animals that uh, are deemed to not be appropriate. And then, of course, for example, something like a pig, you would not be permitted to keep as a pet. A pig, there's considered to be no reason that a Muslim should own a pig. There's considered to be no benefit in owning a pig whatsoever. And so there are certain animals that would be considered to be inappropriate as pets or not permissible as pets. But if a person were to take on certain types of pets, so if they took on fish or cats or some frogs or something like that, then they would just have to make sure that they are being responsible towards those animals and giving those animals their just rights. How can I pray if I'm still learning Arabic? What I usually suggest for people is that in the Shafi method, it's considered to be permissible to read from a piece of paper during the prayer. So usually what I suggest for people is that they write down a transliteration of what is needed to be said in the prayer, and that they can read from that while they pray until they're able to memorize it without the paper. And usually, what I have mentioned to people is that when you do that, is that what will happen is that in the beginning, you'll be completely reliant upon the paper. And as long as you're being consistent in your prayers, you're praying the five daily prayers every day, you'll start to be able to recite quicker and quicker, and then eventually you'll be able to recite quicker, and then you won't need to look at the paper as much until eventually you'll find that you don't really need the paper at all. And in this way, it's a situation where you don't have to necessarily do it by, just rote memorization, but it just like naturally you just progress to the point where you just don't need to look at anything anymore to complete the prayer. So that's usually what I recommend for people, to take that Shafi position, and you can read from a piece of paper while praying. Um, and so I would, so if a person is going to take that position, then they should learn some of the basics of purification and the prayer in the Shafi madhab, which is not too difficult to do. Did you have any difficulty raising your kittens? I'm thinking about fostering in the future to see if I'm ready for it. I mean,
We have cats.
Sister Tahmina, is there a particular madhab that you're following? I don't remember. Hanafi? Well, if you're Hanafi, then you should be good.
Yeah, because
Uh,
we have cats.
the biggest thing is the getting cat hair all over the place, and the Hanafi method, cat hair isn't najis, so that makes it a little bit easier.
Tell
And
yeah.
she already knows. And then the Hanafi madhab, buying something that is najis is not necessarily impermissible if there is considered to be a use for it, and so that will make getting cat food a little bit easier. Like, in my household, we actually still try to get more or less halal cat food, which basically means it's just all the fish-based cat food. Um, but uh, but I guess some of the things to keep in mind is uh, cats, especially if you only have one, they can become a bigger time constraint, just because cats, they need to be stimulated. So, for example, we have two, and that wasn't necessarily by choice, but what that did, especially when they were kittens, it allowed for them to have someone to play with and to get and to take up their attention when we didn't necessarily give them that attention at that particular moment. Because particularly while they're kittens and while they are still young, so basically like the first 2, 3 years with them, uh, they're very much more active. Uh, and so yeah, so the actual general recommendation is, especially if you're going to get kittens, is that you always get them in pairs, because it's just going to make it a little bit easier on you, um, in terms of them having companionship. Um, and then also, but know that by having to, then it's just going to be a greater expense because food and cat litter start to add up. Trust me, I know. Uh, so, um, uh, those are just certain things to keep in mind. And then also, I don't know what your living situation is, but just being mindful to make sure that no one in your household, even yourself, has cat allergies, because that could be another issue. But I mean, the other aspect of it is that, cats are very social animals. So they, if you'll never be alone, so to speak, if you have cats. But then also you have to, another aspect to think about is the litter box. And, do you want to have a regular routine of having to scoop out cat pee and poop and so forth? Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, taking care of any animals is a big responsibility. But I guess you could say the benefit about cats is that cats will give you some type of reciprocation for it. Is that, they'll snuggle, and then also it's also going to depend on the cat. Like, again, I have two, so you can see their personalities. I have one cat that you know, is very much a dependent cat. Like, he always wants to be pet. He always wants to be near someone. If we were to let him, he would just sleep right in our bed, and, so on and so forth. Like, he just always is in need and want of attention uh, and comfort from you. And our other cat, you know, he could basically care less. Like, he doesn't mind getting attention occasionally, but that's not his big motivation. Like he's has no problem going off and exploring where he's not supposed to. But he also is the better hunter of the two. So like uh when we had some flies get into our home, he hunted down a good portion of them on his own. He also in our old house found a mouse one time and tried to gift it to my wife, where she didn't necessarily appreciate it all that much. She appreciated the mouse being gone, but she didn't necessarily appreciate him giving it to her as a gift. So yeah, and they're my two cats are brothers, and you can see they have completely opposite personalities. So that's my insight on cats. Um, I got two job offers. One working in a women's shelter slash mental health facility where I will have to deal with people who will be violent and detoxing from drugs. And other than that, everything else is great. And another job where I teach toddlers. What's your advice as a Muslim would be the better job for a middle-aged Muslima who's trying to work and also would like my job to be a form of sadaqah? Uh, I can't tell you necessarily which one would be better for you because it's going to be based upon your personality and what you're capable of dealing with. I will tell you, as being someone who worked in a prison, that dealing on a regular basis with people who are facing mental health challenges or drug addiction challenges or violent tendencies and so on and so forth, that can take a toll on someone, especially dealing with it day in and day out. Um, just be emotionally draining. Um, but there can be the aspect of the reward of when you're able to see someone be able to progress and become a better person. But again, it can be draining having to go through that day in and day out. Hence I no longer work in a prison. But at the same time, dealing with toddlers is not necessarily an easy job either. Um, and sometimes people, when they are working constantly with toddlers, it can be kind of like emotionally draining from another perspective in that like you're constantly dealing with young children, so it's like you're not getting a lot of adult conversation, you're not getting a lot of adult stimulation, so that can be draining for some people. So really that's why I said it's really going to be based upon like my suggestion would be kind of like be honest with yourself in terms of how your personality is, and try to decide which position is better fitting for your personality to have to go into this position on an everyday basis. And so I can't tell you what your personality necessarily inclines towards, but make that something that you take into heavy consideration, like which position is more inclined towards my personality and such that it won't become an emotional burden upon me. No problem. What are the different creeds? Can you explain the differences in the methods? So when you say the different creeds, creed is usually a term that's associated with aqidah. Um, but oftentimes when you say madhab, madhab is usually referred to for the schools of Islamic law. So the thing is that, um, but sometimes the term madhab will also be used to describe the different schools of creed. So I just want to make sure I have the correct understanding in terms of your question. All right, so are you asking about the different schools of theology, or are you asking about the different schools of Islamic law? Islamic law. Okay. So essentially, the schools of law are essentially man's interpretation of the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, for example, many people have heard of the concept of Sharia. And so, one basic definition or one basic way of understanding Sharia is that the Sharia is the law or the limits set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually wants for the human being. And fiqh, which is usually the term that's used for Islamic law in Arabic, fiqh, that is man's interpretation of that law. That is how man understands that law. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has given us general guidelines to how we are to live our lives, but He's not necessarily given us specifics in terms of all the different possible scenarios that we might find ourselves in. So there are scenarios that come about that we do not have a direct verdict from Allah or from the Messenger of Allah sallam, in terms of how are we supposed to go about this particular situation. So, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He informs us to pray. He says, "Aqimus salat." And then the Messenger of Allah sallam, he gives us a basic description of how to perform that prayer. He says, "Sallu qara'aytani usalli," that pray as you've seen me pray. And the thing is that the Messenger of Allah sallam, he would pray, and different companions would sometimes narrate different things in regards to how they saw the Prophet Muhammad sallam pray. And so, because we have these different narrations about how the companions saw the Prophet Muhammad sallam pray, you have some scholars who have preferred certain descriptions over others based upon the particular methodologies that they use to determine what is the closest to the way of the Prophet Muhammad sallam in light of the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so I guess a better example of how to look at this is that if we were to look at verse number 6 in Surah Al-Ma'idah, which is essentially the verse of wudu. So in the verse of wudu, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that if you come to the prayer, then wash your faces and wash your hands up to and including the elbow, wipe your head and wash your feet. So I'm trying to see if I can pull this up, and I'll just do a quick share screen. So everyone can see this who's on the Zoom call. Okay. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha qumtu ila salati faqsidu wujuhakum wa aydiyakum ila marafiqi wamsa'u bi ru'usikum wa arjulakum ila ka'bayn." So I'm just reading up to this point here. And this is considered to be a portion of the verse of wudu. And this is, this portion of this particular ayah, of this particular verse, is considered to be the verse of wudu. But of course, you can see that there's much more to this particular verse. And so if we go down to the translation that's mentioned here, it says, "O believers, when you rise up for prayer, wash your faces and your hands up to the elbows, wipe your heads and wash your feet to the ankles." And so this section here is what we just read in Arabic. So if I were to go down the line, in the Hanafi school of law, Imam Abu Hanifa, who was one of the founding members of the Hanafi school, yani it's named after him, one of his basic principles was that the Quran, or something that is considered to be mutawatir. When we say mutawatir, that is describing a particular um, source that has been narrated and related by multitudes of people throughout generations. And so, for example, the Quran is mutawatir. There are so many people on every level of narration of the Quran. So going from the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu to the first generation after them, to the next generation after them, there are multitudes of people narrating the Quran in the exact way that we have it today, that it's just unfathomable that all these people have conspired to make up the Quran. It's just like, for example, um, probably none of us have ever been to the North Pole. Has anyone in here been to the North Pole? Yeah, I didn't think so. However, if I were to ask the question, does anyone in here not believe in the North Pole? Again, uh, I wouldn't expect anyone to say that they don't believe in the North Pole. But the thing is, if I ask the question,
Video of the North Pole.
if I would ask the question, why do you believe in the North Pole if you've never actually been there? Like, how do you know that the North Pole exists if you've never actually been to the North Pole?
I know.
And so for the majority of us, the basic answer is going to be is that the existence of the North Pole is so well known and is so uh, spread throughout people that it's just unfathomable that all these people conspired to make up a place called the North Pole. And so that is what it some statements of the Prophet Muhammad that also meet the criterion of mutawatir. But in any case, the Quran undoubtedly is mutawatir. It is known that the Prophet Muhammad related the Quran in this way, and that has been passed down throughout the generations. And so, Imam Abu Hanifa, his position is that something that is mutawatir, like the Quran, cannot be conditioned by something that is not at that level, meaning that it's not itself as well mutawatir. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's established that for the aspect of wudu, that these are the things that you need to do. That you need to wash your face, you need to wash your hands up to the elbow, wipe your head, and wash your feet. And so from the standpoint of Imam Abu Hanifa, the requirements for wudu stop at this verse. So in the Hanafi madhab, for example, there are only four integrals in terms of wudu. There are four things that you have to do for your wudu to be valid. It's not to say that those are the only things that you should do. It's just to say that these are the bare minimum things that you have to do. And that is exactly as the verse says, wash your face, wash your hands up to the elbow, wipe your head, and wash your feet. So Abu Hanifa, he considers that because this is mutawatir, and everything else that we have in relation to wudu is what's referred to as ahad, is something that does not reach the level of mutawatir, that there hasn't been a mass transmission of those things, then those things cannot condition what has already been mentioned in the Quran that is mutawatir but rather those things they may come to the point of, for example, being sunnah, meaning that they're recommended to do, but they are not required for your wudu to actually be valid. Tayyib. That is Imam Abu Hanifa's take on it. Imam Malik, his take on it was that there's a few things. Is that for one, Imam Malik, he looks at the wording of it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, yaksilu wujuhakum. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, to wash your face. So Imam Malik, he is, and it's not to say that Imam Abu Hanifa didn't give a definition to washing either, but Imam Malik gives a specific aspect to washing. So for the most part, all the schools of law, they'll say, and all the imams who originate these schools, they will say that washing indicates the aspect of water flowing over something. However, from the standpoint of Imam Malik, not only does he consider the necessity of something considered to be washed, that water flows over that thing, but also that that thing has to be rubbed as that water is flowing. So from in Arabic, it's called dalk. So Imam Malik, his position is that when you wash any of these limbs, not only do you have to have the water flow, but you have to rub the skin as you're washing. Or else Imam Malik would consider that the wudu is not valid, that implicit in the word ghusl, implicit in the word wash, is the aspect of rubbing. So as the other schools of law would consider to be a sunnah, Imam Malik considers that to be an obligation, such that if you had water flow over these limbs, but you didn't rub those limbs as it was running, then Imam Malik would deem that your wudu is actually not sound. Imam Malik would also look at this and say that the required washing and wiping also need to be done within the same sitting, meaning that there can't be any type of large gap in time in regards to it. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's placing all these things together so that it can't have a long period of time that elapses, meaning like you can't start washing your face and then stop and go and have some breakfast and have a conversation with your neighbor and then come back and then begin washing your arm and your hands. So Imam Malik, he considers that it needs to be a situation such that under normal circumstances, that there's not enough time that elapses such that a previous limb will be able to air dry before you go and you wash the next limb. So meaning like, for example, you've washed your face, you can't wait so long to wash your hands such that your face is capable of drying. So that is something else that Imam Malik understood from this, is that this aspect of what do we ultimately mean in terms of washing, meaning that rubbing is a part of washing, as well as that you can't have a long period of time in between washing / wiping the limbs that need to be washed or wiped. طيب. Imam Shafi'i, he looks at this particular verse and he more or less agrees with Imam Abu Hanifa that these four things are what constitutes the actual wudu itself, that you have to do these four things. But Imam Shafi'i is also looking at hadith, even if they are not mutawatir like the Quran. So Imam Shafi'i, he looks at, for example, the hadith of Umar ibn Khattab, where he mentions إِنَّمَا أَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that actions are only based upon intention, which is not a mutawatir hadith. But Imam Shafi'i will say that you still need to have an intention in order for this wudu to be valid. That even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not mention the necessity of having intention, Imam Shafi'i will say that how are we going to do this? Because Imam Shafi'i is saying that this is an act of worship. That how do you distinguish an act of worship to something that is just mundane? Like, for example, someone just went into the shower to, cool off, whatever the case may be. And in the shower, they happen to wash all these parts. Like, they happen to wash their face, wash their hands up to including the elbow, wipe their, wipe / wash their head and wash their feet. should that person be considered to have made wudu even though their intention was not wudu? Their intention was to cool off. Should that count as a wudu? According to Imam Shafi's understanding, no. Why? Because that's not what they intended. They intended to cool off. So that's what they got. They got to cool off. Whereas wudu was something specific. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he mentions, إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ. So the basis of it is that this is an act of worship that is preparing you for the prayer. So to distinguish it from you cooling off, there needs to be an intention. That is Imam Shafi's understanding. Imam Shafi will also look at it from a linguistical standpoint, a grammar standpoint, that the order that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions these things in also must be maintained. In particular, it's because of the aspect of wiping of the head, breaking up the washing of the feet. That from the standpoint of Arabic grammar, is that the normative way that you would do things is that if order is not significant in a situation, then you would necessarily, not necessarily, but generally speaking, in Arabic, you would group all the like things together. So if it was washing is being mentioned, then you would just group all of the washing elements together and then mention something different. But if order is important, then you would be willing to break up that grouping. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did. He says, uh, he first talks about washing the face, then washing the hands up to the elbow. Then he breaks that order or breaks that grouping by saying wiping the head, and then he goes back to washing the feet. So Imam Shafi, from his intense understanding of Arabic grammar, he understands that the order is also necessary. The order is also needed. Imam Abu Hanifa, he didn't consider that to be implicit in the verse, that he didn't consider that order is a necessity within the validity of the wudu based upon this verse in and of itself. So to not just overburden people with this aspect of usul I was just giving this as an example to say that the aspect of Islamic law, the fiqh of it, our understanding of it, is based upon human interpretation. And so humans, we differ, just like I mentioned about my cats, they have different personalities. Obviously, humans, we have different personalities and we have different ways of seeing things. So, like, if I were to go around the room and I would ask people, like, which interpretation do you kind of incline more towards? Do you take the approach of Abu Hanifa that this is what it says in the Quran, and I'm just going to stick with that in terms of the obligations, and anything that we have from the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu, we would consider that to be a sunnah, something that we should add on to it, but essentially we only have to do these four things? Or would you look at it from the standpoint of, for example, Imam Malik, where we're going to specify, for example, that washing in also entails the aspect of rubbing, and that we have to do this action, yani the action of wudu, in a timely manner, like meaning we can't have a long gap in between uh washings and so on and so forth. But this is why we have difference of opinion in regards to the schools of law. Is that the scholars are looking at these different sources and trying to come to a conclusion that is the closest to what the actual Sharia is. Remember, we said before that the Sharia is the actual law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually intended and wanted from the human being. The fiqh is us trying to interpret that. And so that is, why you have some of the differences between the schools of law. So did that help to give you a basis? Have fun. No problem. Yeah, yeah. Any more
Fun.
comments or questions or anything before we wrap up for the night? When should I wear a head covering slash how do I decide? Um, do you mean what are the situations that require for a woman to wear a head covering? Or okay, so there are different situations in which a woman would be required to wear a head covering. So this is going based upon the concept that, slavery does not exist legally in most societies. So we're gonna, go based upon the aspect that all women in our societies and most of our societies are hurwa, uh, hurwa, that they are free women. And so for a free woman, there are three different scenarios that relate to the hijab. So the first one is when a woman, well, it's actually possibly more than three, but the first one is in relation to a woman when she is around her mahrams. Her mahrams are her non-marriageable kin. So these are people who, by this sacred law, she is not permitted to marry permanently. So these are people like her father, her brother by blood, whether it be a full brother or a half brother. It can also be a suckling brother, meaning that if she had a wet nurse that she suckled from other than her mother, any of those children that is the children of that particular wet nurse mother would be her suckling brothers and sisters. And so she would not have to, wear hijab in front of her brother by way of suckling. This would also include her grandfathers all the way up, if they're however many may be alive. This will also include her sons and grandsons all the way down. It also includes her uncles by blood, not by marriage, uncles by blood. Um, and so these would be considered to be her mahrams, her non-marriageable kin, as well as around other Muslim women. In that particular case, she is not required to wear a hijab. It is permissible for her to go without the hijab in front of those individuals. In the case of a woman praying, then she is required to wear the hijab. She has to properly cover herself, and part of that is going to be the wearing of the hijab when she's in salat. If she is out where she can be seen by non-mahram men or non-Muslim women, then she is to wear the hijab. Now, the non-Muslim women aspect, there is a difference of opinion in regards to that. But if a woman wants to be more precautious, then even around non-Muslim women, she would wear the hijab. Um, and then the fourth scenario would be in relation to a woman's husband, in which she is not required to wear a hijab around him. and even to the points that essentially there is nothing that has to necessarily be covered up between a husband and wife. So those are essentially the four different scenarios that a woman may be in and how the hijab will be affected by those various scenarios. Wassalam wa yakum. Yeah. So again, those are the four different scenarios that a woman might find herself in and how the hijab will be related to those four scenarios. We might have time for like one last uh, question or comment if anyone has anyone going once, going twice. Okay. So maybe we'll just stop here. Uh, and I actually might be able to just make it to Salat Isha. But and Alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair for everyone for joining us for this Living Islam session. Um, And inshallah, if there was any benefit that was found, then of course that only comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And any mistakes that were made was to the weakness of my own self. And so I ask that you please forgive me. And please keep us all in your du'as, inshallah. And inshallah, we will leave you all in Allah's care. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. الله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وحسبنا ونعم الوكيل. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.